For decades, a story has circulated in conspiracy books, internet forums, and sensationalist documentaries. According to this version, Adolf Hitler did not die in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. He escaped. He boarded a submarine, crossed the South Atlantic, and disappeared into the icy depths of Antarctica, where the Nazis had secretly built a colossal underground base, geothermally heated, equipped with hangars for experimental craft and docks for submarines. An impregnable fortress called New Berchtesgaden, hidden beneath the Mühlich-Hofmann Mountains, waiting for the moment of the Reich's resurgence. The story has all the ingredients of the perfect myth: a state secret, mysterious technology, the greatest villain in history escaping justice. The traceable origin of this account has a name and a date. On July 16, 1945, barely 6 weeks after Germany's surrender, the Argentine newspaper La Critica published an article signed by Ladislas Szabo, a Hungarian exile living in Buenos Aires. In it, he claimed that the submarine U-530, which had just arrived at the port of Mar del Plata without prior notice, had transported Hitler and other Nazi officials to Antarctica. The story was reproduced the following day in the Toronto Daily Star under the headline, "Hitler is in the ice in Antarctica." Szabo expanded the account in a book published in 1947 titled Hitler is Alive, in which he described a secret base built since 1938 by order of Admiral Karl Dönitz. What Szabo invented, others repeated, expanded and embellished for decades. Tunnels carved into solid rock, underground lakes, Nazi flying saucers defending the perimeter of the base against the American Operation High Jump of 1946 to 1947. Each version took the previous one as its source, building a house of cards upon an original lie. What is real, what historical archives and scientific research document with precision, is another story. A less fantastical one, but in many ways far more interesting. In January 1939, Germany sent a secret expedition to the Antarctic territory known as Queen Maud Land. It had concrete economic and strategic objectives. Its results were real and documented. And what happened afterward, between 1939 and 1945, with the war as its backdrop, is a story of polar geopolitics that deserves to be told with rigor. Germany's interest in Antarctica was not born of any mystical obsession or plans for world domination. It was born of whale fat. In the second half of the 1930s, Germany was one of the most important whaling powers on the planet. Its fleet in the Antarctic Ocean comprised 50 whaling vessels and 7 factory ships. In the 1938 to 1939 season, that fleet produced 492,532 barrels of oil. Whale oil was not an industrial luxury. It was a resource of the highest strategic order. It was used to manufacture margarine on a massive scale, which the German population needed as a source of dietary fat. It was employed as a lubricant in industrial machinery, and its derivative, glycerin, was an indispensable raw material for the production of nitroglycerin, an essential component of military explosives. In an economy oriented toward war, interrupting that flow was equivalent to striking simultaneously at the civilian food supply and at the army's war-making capacity. Hermann Göring's 4-year plan, approved in September 1936 and designed to make Germany self-sufficient in raw materials before the conflict that Hitler considered inevitable within 4 years, depended in critical part on maintaining that uninterrupted supply of animal oil. Göring was aware that war implied naval blockades, and that any resource Germany could not produce or secure internally would become a strategic Achilles heel. Whale oil was one of those resources. It could not be produced within the Reich. It could only be obtained in the southern oceans. The problem was that the waters where the German fleet operated did not belong to Germany. The whaling fleet worked off the coasts of what the Norwegians called Queen Maud Land, a region that Norwegian expeditions had partially explored from the coast during the preceding decades. Lars Christensen, a Norwegian shipowner and sponsor of several Antarctic expeditions, had sent ships to those latitudes in 1927, 1928 to 1929, 1930 to 1931, 1933 to 1934, and 1936 to 1937, accumulating considerable coastal knowledge. Norway had not yet formalized its territorial claim by royal proclamation. That step would come in January 1939. But its interests in the area were clear, widely recognized in international diplomatic and scientific circles, and its whaling fleet had dominated those waters for decades. Great Britain, for its part, controlled vast areas of the South Atlantic through the system of the Falkland Islands dependencies, whose legal existence dated back to the Letters Patent of 1908, amended in 1917. Under that colonial structure, London required the payment of fishing concessions from any nation wishing to operate in zones under its jurisdiction. Germany already paid those concessions in the South Atlantic. Berlin interpreted that situation as a form of unacceptable economic dependence in a time of rising tension, and did not want to find itself in the same position in the Antarctic if the territory frequented by its whalers were formally claimed by any power. The lesson was clear: whoever does not plant a flag pays concessions. Within that framework, during 1937 and 1938, senior officials of the German government began to explore the possibility of sending a secret expedition to the Antarctic sector used by the whaling fleet. The idea was presented to Goering, who approved it as part of the 4-year plan. The official mandate contemplated 2 publicly acknowledged objectives and 1 reserved. The first, to continue the German scientific tradition of polar exploration initiated by Erich von Drygalski, who had explored the Antarctic coasts around 90 degrees east with the Gauss expedition of 1901 to 1903, and by Wilhelm Filchner, who had sailed the Weddell Sea in 1911 to 1912. The second declared objective was the reconnaissance of a suitable location for a support base for the whaling fleet. The reserved objective, according to historian Cornelia Ludecker, who studied the German expedition archives in depth, was to assess the strategic opportunities the southern continent might offer, including aircraft performance under conditions of extreme temperature. That knowledge, as Goering himself knew, could prove valuable when Germany initiated military operations in severe winters. The technical planning of the expedition was carried out by the Kriegsmarine, although the official character of the project was largely civilian. The vessel chosen was the MS Schwabenland, owned by the airline Lufthansa, and normally operated on transatlantic airmail routes between Europe and South America, where it functioned as a floating refueling station for seaplanes. It was an 8,000-ton ship equipped with catapults to launch seaplanes, cranes to recover them from the water, and complete maintenance and refueling workshops. Its infrastructure made it ideal for transporting and operating aircraft in remote waters, and it had been designed precisely for that purpose. The flight and maintenance crews would be civilian Lufthansa personnel, not military aviators. The destination of the expedition, the region between the coasts of Queen Maud Land and the interior of the continent, was not chosen at random. It was exactly the area where the German whaling fleet operated. Otto Kraul, the veteran whaler included in the expedition as ice pilot, knew those waters from having navigated them in several previous seasons. His presence was not decorative. He was the one who had to guide the Schwabenland safely among the coastal ice flows and evaluate, from practical knowledge, whether a zone had suitable conditions to serve as a future base for the factory ships. The name chosen for the territory Germany hoped to claim was Neuschwabenland. The designation was deliberately evocative. Swabia is a historical region in southwestern Germany, and the name projected onto the Antarctic ice an imperial continuity with medieval resonances. But the operation was far more pragmatic than poetic. The government in Berlin needed whale oil to feed its population and manufacture explosives. And if securing that supply required mapping an unknown territory, dropping swastika flags from aircraft, and claiming sovereignty over millions of square kilometers of perpetual ice, that was exactly what would be done. The expedition was kept secret during its preparation. The preparations in the port of Hamburg were discreet, and the departure of the Schwabenland on December 17, 1938, was not publicly announced. The German government hoped to present the world with a fait accompli, a territory discovered, mapped and claimed, before any other power had the opportunity to react. That logic, however, would not entirely work as expected. The Schwabenland set sail from Hamburg on December 17, 1938. At its command, as expedition leader, was Captain Alfred Richer. Richer was not a soldier in the conventional sense. Although he was part of the Kriegsmarine personnel in a civilian capacity, his real career was that of an explorer and aviator. He had participated in polar expeditions to the Arctic, was an experienced seaman and a certified pilot. His reputation within German polar exploration circles was solid, and the technical expertise, not any military rank, is what led to his command. The decision to use Richter reflected the true nature of the mission. It was not a covert military operation, but a scientific economic reconnaissance expedition requiring specific knowledge of polar navigation and aircraft operations under extreme conditions. Accompanying him were Lufthansa pilots and mechanics responsible for operating and maintaining the two seaplanes on board, the Boreas and the Passat. Both were 10-ton Dornier Wal, a twin-engine seaplane with a metal hull that had proven its reliability on ocean crossings during the previous decade. The Dornier Wal had an approximate flight range of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers depending on the load, sufficient to penetrate hundreds of kilometers inland from the mothership's position and return. The feature that made them particularly valuable for this mission was their ability to operate from water. They could land in protected bays among ice floes, refuel from the ship and take off again. Otto Kroll, the veteran whaler included as an ice pilot, had navigated these same waters in previous seasons and knew their particularities: currents, sea ice distribution, points where the coastal shelf was navigable and where it was not. His presence was essential for the ship's safety in waters no map described accurately. Crowell also contributed an entire chapter on ice conditions to the expedition's later scientific report, published in 1942. The crew was completed by a group of scientists specializing in various disciplines: oceanography, meteorology, geography, and marine biology. The voyage from Hamburg to the operational area took approximately 1 month. The Schwabenland reached the waters off Queen Maud Land on January 19, 1939, and remained active until February 15. 26 days of effective operations. During that window, the weather was not uniformly favorable. Good weather days were the ones when flights could be conducted, and flights were the raison d'etre of the expedition. As the ship moved along the coastal strip conducting bathymetric surveys and collecting seabed and water samples, the Boreas and Passat took off from Schwabenland's catapult, penetrated inland, and photographed the territory from the air using adjustable obliquity cameras mounted on the fuselage. It was the first time in history that an expedition systematically carried out aerial photographic coverage of that Antarctic sector. The methodology was the same used in continental aerial photogrammetry: parallel flights with sufficient image overlap to theoretically produce stereoscopic maps of the terrain. The aircraft overflew a strip between 69 degrees south and 74 degrees south latitude and between 5 degrees west and 18 degrees east longitude, covering an estimated 250,000 square kilometers with oblique aerial photography. The absence of verified ground reference points, so-called ground truth, that is, measurements taken on the ground that allow calibration of aerial photographs, was the main technical flaw of the operation. Without those anchors, converting the aerial images into accurate maps introduced significant cumulative errors. It was later discovered, when the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition 1949 to 1952 could take ground measurements in the same region, that Richter's maps located some peaks up to 50 kilometers off their actual position and depicted them up to 1,000 meters higher than they really were. The maps were corrected in the mid-1950s with those ground data and revised again in the 1980s by cartographer K. Brunk, who compared the expedition's original photographs with Landsat satellite imagery to accurately reconstruct the aircraft flight paths. What the pilots found when flying over the interior changed the map of the continent. The Norwegians, who had explored the coastline from the sea during the Norvegia expedition of 1929 and subsequent campaigns, only knew the coastal area and had sighted the Saur-Rondaine Mountains on February 6, 1937, about 200 kilometers east of the area explored by the German expedition. But the far western interior, over which the Boreas and Passat flew, was unknown. What they found there was a mountain range of considerable size, over 800 kilometers long from east to west, with peaks reaching 3,000 meters in height, located approximately 200 to 250 kilometers inland from the edge of the coastal ice shelf. They named it the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains. Its highest peak was Jokelkirke at 3,148 meters in the eastern sector of the range. The landscape the pilots described in their reports was of particular Arctic beauty and absolute hostility. The coast was mostly an ice cliff 10 to 30 meters high, the vertical edge of a floating platform approximately 100 kilometers wide. This platform was the marine extension of the continental ice sheet, which gradually rose inland to reach a plateau between 2,500 and 3,000 meters high. The transition between the coastal platform and the inner plateau was interrupted here and there by nunataks, rocky peaks emerging from the ice like islands of dark rock on a white sea. And then, as the terrain rose, by the mass of the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, whose snow-covered peaks rose 500 to 1,000 meters above the surrounding ice surface. Near the coast, around 12 degrees east longitude, the pilots detected something completely unexpected, a dark patch in the white landscape. An area of approximately 34 square kilometers of exposed rock without snow, with several small lakes of visible water. They named it the Schirmacher Oasis, after pilot Richard Schirmacher, who detected it from the air. On a continent where 98% of the ground is covered by permanent ice, a snow-free rocky area was a remarkable geographic anomaly. The expedition's geographer Ernst Hermann later speculated in his 1942 popular science book that the lakes could be heated by subterranean geothermal activity, a hypothesis that proved incorrect. The lakes are simply the result of summer melting and topographical retention, but it had significant consequences in the mythology that followed. Only 3 landings were made during the entire expedition, all on the coastal ice shelf. In each case, small groups of men briefly, less than 1 day on each occasion, went ashore from the ship in boats or from the planes to take detailed photographs, collect surface geological samples, and make direct observations. The interior was not explored on foot. The expedition's flight logs, published by Richter in 1942 and analyzed in detail by Brunk in the 1980s, confirm that none of the planes landed on any solid surface during the entire campaign. Boreas landed once on the edge of the coastal ice to take samples, as documented by an archival photograph showing the plane floating next to the vertical platform wall with men looking down from the ice. That image was later distorted decades afterward by authors such as Ernst Zündel, writing under the pseudonym Christoph Friedrich, to falsely claim it showed a seaplane on one of the lakes of the Schirmacher Oasis, fabricated proof that the expedition had explored the interior. Following the original plan, the Schwabenland planted German flags at several points along the coast, and the planes dropped pennants with swastikas over the hinterland, a symbolic act intended to serve as documentary evidence for future sovereignty claims. What Richter did not know while carrying out this part of the mission was that Norway had already acted. On January 14, 1939, 5 days before the German planes began flights over the interior, the Norwegian government had formally, by royal decree, claimed Queen Maud Land. The German expedition conducted its mapping and symbolic marking over a territory that, under international law, already had an official claimant. When the Schwabenland returned to Hamburg on April 12, 1939, the diplomatic situation had changed, and Germany made no formal claim of sovereignty over the territory it had named Neuschwabenland. The existence of the expedition was kept secret until March 9, 1939, when an official sober announcement confirmed that Germany had discovered and mapped from the air a large area of the Antarctic continent. Scientific results began to be published in German technical literature that same year. Deutsche Seewarte published a preliminary report in 1939. Helmut Wohltat, an official of the 4-year plan who had overseen the expedition's planning, published an overview, and Crowell released a popular science book translated into several languages. Richter's full scientific report appeared in 1942, when the war had already been ongoing for 3 years. Preliminary maps derived from the expedition circulated quickly within the international cartographic community. They appeared on new Antarctic maps published in Australia in 1939, and on a chart by the US Hydrographic Office in 1943. Shortly after the Schwabenland returned to Germany, planners began discussing the next phase. Since the Norwegian claim complicated German ambitions in Queen Maud Land, other areas were explored. According to Ludecker, plans for the 1939 to 1940 season included visiting the Antarctic Pacific sector between 80 degrees west and 130 degrees west, an area at that time not claimed by any country. This shift in objective suggests that the Schwabenland expedition had not achieved its original territorial purpose. The presence of Norway had closed that door before Germany could pass through. While Germany abandoned its Antarctic ambitions, Great Britain made a strategic decision in the opposite direction. The geopolitical context of the Western Antarctic sector in 1940 was a three-player board with overlapping claims and no referee. Great Britain had maintained since 1908 a formal claim to the sector between the meridians 20 degrees west and 80 degrees west, established by letters patent and amended in 1917. This sector included the entire Antarctic Peninsula, the South Shetland Islands, the South Orkney Islands, the South Sandwich Islands, and South Georgia, all grouped under the name Falkland Islands Dependencies, with the nearest colony being the Falkland Islands themselves, about 1,200 kilometers to the north. Argentina had begun presenting claims to practically the same sector since 1925, relying on arguments of geographic continuity with its Patagonian territory and the legacy of treaties from the Spanish colonial period. Chile formally joined in 1940, claiming the sector between the meridians 53 degrees west and 90 degrees west, which overlapped with both the British and Argentine claims. The problem for Great Britain was not only legal, it was operational. In international law regarding territorial claims, especially in remote territories without an indigenous population, the principle of effective occupation was gaining increasing weight. It was not enough to publish a decree in London. One had to be there physically, continuously, and demonstrably. Argentina understood this perfectly and had begun placing sovereignty markers at strategic points in the disputed sector. On November 1, 1942, an Argentine expedition left boundary markers and metal plaques on Deception Island, the partially flooded volcanic crater in the South Shetlands, which contained a naturally protected harbour, one of the few in all of Western Antarctica, with coal deposits accumulated over decades of Norwegian and British whaling activity. The British response was immediate and decisive. On January 5, 1943, the auxiliary cruiser HMS Carnarvon Castle arrived at Deception Island, removed the Argentine sovereignty symbols, and raised the Union Jack. It was an act of active sovereignty, not a conventional military operation, but in the context of the war, it had implications beyond diplomatic protocol. Argentina maintained neutrality that in practice favored the Axis. It had hosted German intelligence agents, allowed the operation of pro-German communication networks, and its public positions on the war were systematically balanced at best and lenient toward Berlin at worst. Allowing Argentina to consolidate its presence in the Antarctic territories claimed by Great Britain during the war effectively meant leaving space for a neutral power sympathetic to the enemy. This was the direct background that led the Admiralty in 1943 to plan a permanent occupation operation. The project was given the codename Operation Tabarin. Historians have discussed the origin of the name without reaching a definitive consensus. Vivian Fuchs, who led the British Antarctic Survey for decades and wrote the official history of the operation in 1982, does not give a definitive explanation. What is documented, however, is the command structure. The operation was planned and executed by the Royal Navy under the supervision of the Colonial Office, and its purpose combined the demonstration of effective sovereignty with the collection of intelligence on naval movements in the South Atlantic and the support of scientific and geographical research programs. The three objectives were inseparable in the original conception. Preparations began in the summer of 1943. Two ships were selected, the William Scoresby, an oceanographic research vessel built in 1926 and regularly used by the Discovery Committee for whaling studies in the South Atlantic, and the Fitzroy, a supply vessel for the Falklands. Neither was a warship. The members of the expedition, a mix of naval officers, radio operators, meteorologists, and other scientists, departed from London in November 1943. Their instructions were precise: establish inhabited bases at the geographically most convenient points in the sector claimed by Great Britain, preferably in places where the presence of Argentina or Chile was more active or more likely. Both ships reached the Falkland Islands, where they loaded supplies and received updated information about conditions in the region. On January 29, 1944, they set sail south. The first stop was Deception Island in the South Shetlands, which they reached on February 3, 1944. Deception was the natural target, a strategic point with an accessible inner bay, the flooded crater called Puerto Foster by whalers, and with the precedent of the previous year's sovereignty incident. There they established Base B with 5 men who would remain for the austral winter of 1944. The group included a naval officer, a meteorologist, a geologist, and radio operators. The facility was small, a series of prefabricated wooden buildings with insufficient insulation against the winds that swept the island during the winter months when temperatures could drop below -20 degrees Celsius inside the crater. From Deception, the ships headed to Hope Bay at the northeastern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, where a second base was planned. Weather conditions prevented this. Winds of force 10 and 0 visibility forced them to find an alternative. The solution came in the form of Port Lockroy, a sheltered bay on the south coast of Vinca Island in the Palmer Archipelago, west of the Antarctic Peninsula. The bay offered relatively calm waters, and within it lay the small Goudier Island, only 500 meters long, where Base A was established on February 11, 1944. 9 men spent the winter there. Base A at Port Lockroy became the most active facility of Operation Tabarin, with a continuous program of meteorological observations, ionospheric research, and monitoring of naval communications. The meteorological observations at Port Lockroy, begun in 1944, were integrated into the World Meteorological Organization's network of stations and continued for decades. Base D at Hope Bay, which could not be established in 1944, was finally set up between February 12 and 28, 1945. 13 men spent the winter there, the largest complement of any Operation Tabarin base. Hope Bay had particular strategic importance. It was located at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, geographically closest to Argentina and Chile, and its position made it an ideal node for meteorological observations of the South Atlantic and for monitoring maritime traffic through the Drake Passage. The size of these bases was modest to the point of austerity. Base B on Deception Island had 5 people in 1944, 4 in 1945, and 4 in 1946. Base A at Port Lockroy housed 9 people in 1944 and 4 in each of the following 2 years. Base D at Hope Bay started with 13 people in 1945 and maintained 8 in 1946. The men at these bases lived under conditions combining extreme isolation, no physical contact with the outside world for months, with cold, dampness, and continuous work. Their diaries and memoirs, some later published, describe winters of almost total darkness, storms blocking exits for consecutive days, and forced cohabitation requiring considerable personal discipline. Lieutenant James, who served at Base A, published a book in 1949 titled That Frozen Land with his experiences of that first winter. The activities of Operation Tabarin were predominantly scientific, though framed within a strategic purpose. Radio operators monitored frequencies used by ships in the South Atlantic. Meteorologists conducted systematic observations transmitted in cipher to London. Geologists collected rock samples and produced maps of the terrain during good weather periods. The scientific results were considered valuable enough by the British government to continue the program well beyond the end of the war. The geography of all this activity is crucial for understanding what was real and what was invented. All Operation Tabarin bases were located on the Antarctic Peninsula and surrounding islands in the western sector of the continent, west of the Weddell Sea. The easternmost base, Base D at Hope Bay, was approximately at 63 degrees south and 57 degrees west. Queen Maud Land began on the other side of the Weddell Sea, more than 1,000 kilometers east and southeast, in a completely different sector of the continent, under Norwegian claim and outside any strategic area of interest for British sovereignty. There was no reason, logistical, diplomatic, strategic or scientific, for Great Britain to establish a base there. The interests defended by Operation Tabarin were those of the Falkland Islands dependencies, not a Norwegian Antarctic sector. In July 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender and with the war in the Pacific still ongoing, Operation Tabarin was transferred from the Admiralty to the Colonial Office and became an entirely civilian activity. The new organization was named the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey, abbreviated FIDS. The work program did not change substantially. The same bases, the same types of research, the same pattern of annual personnel and supply rotations. What changed was the administrative structure and the legal character of the presence. It was no longer a naval war operation, but a permanent colonial scientific program. FIDS continued creating new bases in the following years. Base C at Cape Geddes in January 1946, Base E on Stonington Island in February 1946, Base F on the Argentine Islands in January 1947, Base G in Admiralty Bay in January 1947, and Base H on Seney Island in March 1947. On the morning of July 10, 1945, 62 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, a submarine appeared in the waters of the Rio de la Plata and approached the Argentine military port of Mar del Plata. No one was expecting it. Lieutenant Otto Wehrmuth, commander of U-530, had destroyed the ship's navigation documents and all military material before requesting entry into the port. This destruction of papers, completely atypical for a conventional surrender, naval protocols required delivering vessels with intact documentation, was the first sign that triggered speculation. Wehrmuth apparently arrived convinced that he would be well received by the Argentine authorities. Argentina had declared war on Germany only on March 27, 1945, a week before President Franklin Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, and only 6 weeks before Germany's surrender. It was a late and politically calculated declaration of war to secure a position in the United Nations, not a genuine change of sympathies. Wehrmuth probably knew that. The U-530 was a Type 9C/40 submarine, a long-range variant of the successful Type 9 design of the Kriegsmarine. Its surface displacement was approximately 1,120 tons and submerged 1,545 tons. It could reach 19.2 knots on the surface using its two MAN diesel engines of 2,200 horsepower each, and 7.3 knots submerged with its electric motors. Its range was 22,150 kilometers at 10 knots on the surface, making it suitable for missions in the South Atlantic without the need for resupply. It was armed with 4 bow torpedo tubes and 2 stern tubes and carried a 105mm deck gun. Its standard crew was about 54 men, although late war variants could have slightly different complements. According to interrogation records archived at Nara, U-530 departed Kristiansand on the southern coast of Norway on March 3, 1945. It spent 10 days at the Horten base in the Oslo Fjord and began sailing toward the open Atlantic on March 13th. Interrogation records placed the vessel operating in waters off New York between May 4th and 7th. When Wehrmuth received confirmation of the German surrender on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, he decided not to surrender. He left the New York area on May 10th, heading south. The interrogators determined that U-530 crossed the equator on June 17th and arrived in Mar del Plata on July 10th with a total journey from New York of 61 days. Sailing at 7.5 knots on the surface at night and 2 knots submerged during the day until 20 degrees south, and then at 9 knots on the surface, speed and distance calculations produce a transit time of approximately 65 days, slightly longer than the actual 61, consistent with favorable navigation conditions during some segments. On August 17th, 5 weeks after U-530, a second submarine appeared in Mar del Plata, U-977, commanded by Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer. It was a Type Phi YIC/41 submarine, smaller and with less range than U-530, but the most produced type of the war, over 560 units built. Its displacement was 759 tons on the surface and 860 tons submerged. Its maximum speed was 17.7 knots on the surface and 7.6 knots submerged, with a range of 14,500 kilometers at 10 knots. Schaefer published his memoirs in 1952 under the title U-977, giving the version of events he had reported to his interrogators. U-977 left Kristiansand on May 2, 1945. With the news of the surrender on May 8th, Schaefer gave his men the choice. Anyone who wanted to go ashore could do so. 16 sailors chose to disembark near Bergen on the Norwegian coast on the night of May 10th. With 32 men remaining, Schaefer submerged the vessel and began the long journey south using the snorkel, a ventilation tube that allowed the vessel to refresh air and charge batteries without fully surfacing, to navigate under the surface for 66 consecutive days while circling the British Isles and heading down the African coast. This period of almost continuous submersion was an operational record for a World War II submarine. They crossed the equator on July 23rd and surrendered in Mar del Plata on August 17th with all ship documents intact. The integrity of U-977's documentation was decisive for the interrogators. Crew lists for both vessels were provided by the Argentine Navy and published by Szabo in his 1947 book. U-530 arrived with 54 men, the standard crew for that type of submarine, and U-977 with 32, explained by the 16 voluntary departures in Bergen. Szabo claimed, with no technical basis, that both vessels should have arrived with only 18 to 27 men, implying that they had left passengers somewhere along the route. This claim was repeated for decades by subsequent authors. It was completely false. Kriegsmarine records and Clay Blair's studies of the German submarine war established the standard crew sizes for both vessel types precisely. The interrogations were conducted successively by the Argentine, US, and British navies. The interrogators had clear objectives: to determine whether the submarines had transported Hitler, other high-ranking Nazis, or Reich treasures, and to determine whether they had visited Antarctica at any point along the route. Wormuth and Schaefer's responses were consistent. They had not carried any passengers, had not visited any point on the South American coast before Mar del Plata, and of course had not been to Antarctica. The interrogators found the explanations plausible and consistent with the available technical data and eventually released both commanders and their crews. Later investigations by R.C. Newton, published in the context of studies on German movements to Argentina after the war, also found no documentary evidence of any special function for these submarines. The most important physical factor to evaluate the possibility that either submarine could have visited Antarctica is the timeline. U-530 left New York on May 10th. If it had sailed south to visit the coast of Queen Maud Land, approximately 70 degrees south, some 11,000 kilometers from New York, and then continued to Mar del Plata, another 6,000 kilometers from Antarctica, it would have traveled a total distance of approximately 17,000 kilometers in 61 days, requiring an average sustained speed of over 11 knots. That was impossible for a vessel that, according to its own commander, traveled 7.5 knots on the surface at night and 2 knots submerged during the day, using that cadence precisely to conserve fuel. But the ultimate obstacle was sea ice. June, July, and August are winter in the southern hemisphere. NASA satellite data, later analyzed in several studies, show that sea ice off the coast of Queen Maud Land extends approximately 500 kilometers from shore in May and June, and up to 1,665 kilometers in July, August, and September. For U-530 to have reached the Antarctic coast and returned toward Argentina, it would have needed to navigate roughly 1,000 kilometers under ice. For U-977, given its later route, the distance would have been about 3,300 kilometers under ice. World War II diesel-electric submarines did not have independent oxygen production systems. Without CO2 scrubbers, devices that remove carbon dioxide, breathable air inside the hull ran out in about 48 hours without renewal. To refresh the air, the vessel had to surface or use the snorkel, which required at least the end of the tube to be exposed to the atmosphere. Under a sea ice cover of 1 to 2 meters thick, neither option was viable. The vessel would have had to break the ice to surface, and the hulls of submarines of the time were not reinforced for that kind of pressure. During Operation High Jump in the Antarctic summer of 1947, the submarine USS Senet suffered hull damage from summer ice movement and had to be assisted by the icebreaker North Wind. Conditions in the deep winter would have been incomparably more destructive. Navigation under the ice would have been further problematic for orientation reasons. In the Antarctic winter, the sun does not rise above the horizon along the coasts of Queen Maud Land during June and July. The sky remains dark for 24 hours with frequent cloud cover. Without solar or stellar visibility, obtaining accurate navigation positions with the methods available in 1945 was practically impossible. Navigating in total darkness under ice to a poorly charted coast with variably sized icebergs randomly distributed through the surrounding waters would have posed a suicidal risk for any commander valuing his crew's survival. Assuming in the exercise of extreme possibility that one of these submarines had miraculously reached the coast, it would have encountered the following: average temperature -26 degrees Celsius, average winds 28 kilometers per hour, wind chill -40 degrees Celsius, permanent darkness, and a coastal ice platform 10 to 30 meters above sea level, a vertical ice wall that would have made landing impossible without specialized equipment. From that coast to the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, the supposed location of the base, lay 200 kilometers of flat ice punctuated by invisible crevasses in total darkness, with no map, no vehicles, no sled dogs. Regarding the only anomalous physical element mentioned in the U-530 chronicles, the 540 collis of cigarettes Szabo reported having counted, the chain of distortion illustrates how historical mythologies function. Collis is a French word meaning package or bundle. In the context of a ship, it probably referred to cartons of cigarettes. In Friedrich's version, published in 1979, these packages were transformed into 540 large cans or barrels, and the text was accompanied by a photograph of a submarine with barrels on deck, suggesting the barrels were filled with cigarettes. Friedrich was the same author who had falsified the photograph of a seaplane on the edge of the ice platform to pass it off as an image of a plane in the Schirmacher oasis. Both distortions, the ship and the cigarettes, are representative of the method. Take a real detail, amplify it, accompany it with decontextualized visual evidence, and present the whole as proof of something that never happened. In October 1945, the 1st SAS Regiment was formally disbanded by order of the British Army General Headquarters. The decision was not a surprise. The SAS had been created in July 1941 by Lieutenant David Stirling as a special operations unit in the North African desert, designed to strike airfields and supply depots deep behind enemy lines. For 4 years it had operated in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and the Netherlands, gaining a reputation for devastating effectiveness disproportionate to its size. But with Germany surrendered and Japan just weeks from its own surrender, the British Army was undergoing an accelerated demobilization. Special operations units, designed for infiltration and sabotage warfare, had no obvious place in peacetime order of battle. The SAS was disbanded. Its men, discharged from active service, were free to pursue new paths. 3 of its most outstanding members chose a path that no one would have anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne, commander of the 1st SAS Regiment in the final stage of the war, was in October 1945 one of the most highly decorated active British soldiers. A Northern Irishman, born in Newtownards, County Down in 1915, he had played international rugby for Ireland before the war and had proven himself in combat with a bravery bordering on recklessness and exceptional tactical ability. He had received 4 Distinguished Service Orders, the second highest award of the British Army, in recognition of operations in the desert, Italy, and northwest Europe. Some of his superiors had proposed the Victoria Cross, the highest distinction, though the recommendation was not approved for reasons that military historians have debated without reaching a definitive consensus. Alongside Mayne, Majors J. Tonkin and M. Sadler were also demobilized when the regiment was disbanded. The 3 shared something beyond their SAS record: the pursuit of a new challenge with the intensity to which combat had accustomed them. In that sense, Antarctica offered something genuine, an environment of hostility comparable to any theater of war, with the difference that the adversary was the climate and terrain, not an enemy army. The newly created Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey, the civilian organization that succeeded Operation Tabarin in July 1945, was seeking personnel with the physical and mental capacity to work under extreme isolation. The 3 former SAS officers signed 2-year civilian contracts. A precise chronological reconstruction of the movements of these 3 men was carried out by biographer H. Ross in his book Paddy Mayne, Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne, 1 SAS Regiment, published in 2003, based on Mayne's personal diary and documents preserved by his family. This research allows for the accurate refutation of claims by some authors who place SAS men in the Falklands in October 1945. supposedly preparing a mission to attack a Nazi base in Queen Maud Land. Maine arrived in Montevideo, Uruguay on the 8th of December 1945 in transit to the Falklands. Sadler and Tonkin arrived shortly afterward via the same route. The three reached Port Stanley, the capital of the Falklands, between 21st and 30th December 1945, divided into three groups travelling on slightly different dates. Maine and Tonkin departed Port Stanley on the 9th of January 1946 aboard a FIDS vessel and visited successively Base B on Deception Island, arriving there on the 13th of January, and Base A at Port Lockroy, which they reached on the 17th of January. On 23rd January, they returned to Port Stanley. The entire journey lasted 14 days and took place entirely within the Antarctic Peninsula sector, over 1,000 kilometers west of Queen Maud Land. Upon returning to Port Stanley, Maine was hospitalized. The back pain he suffered was the result of an old injury, probably accumulated over years of operations in which he had endured considerable physical wear. The condition was severe enough to prevent him from continuing the fieldwork required by the expedition. Maine left the Falklands and returned to Britain, arriving in March 1946. His participation in the Antarctic expedition was brief, physically limited, and entirely civilian. He died in a traffic accident in Newtownards on the 14th of December 1955 at the age of 40. Tonkin and Sadler continued without Maine. Sadler helped establish the new Base E on Stonington Island in Marguerite Bay on the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula in February 1946. Stonington Island was a small island, just over a kilometre long, in a geographically advantageous position for exploring the peninsula to the south. The base was built with prefabricated materials transported from the Falklands, and Sadler was part of the team that assembled the structures under the conditions of the austral summer of 1946, with temperatures ranging from -5 degrees Celsius to +5 degrees Celsius on the best days, but dropping rapidly with any bad weather front. Sadler remained in the area during the austral summer of 1947, carrying out geographic and cartographic fieldwork. His contribution was that of a civilian explorer, not a soldier on a combat mission. There is one chronological detail that makes any version of the story involving the SAS in a December 1945 attack on a German base impossible. The 1st SAS Regiment was formally disbanded in October 1945. It was not reconstituted until 1948, when the 21st SAS Regiment was created as a reserve unit. During this 3-year interval, the SAS did not exist as a military entity. Its former members were civilians. A military SAS operation in Antarctica in December 1945 would have required the regiment to be active, its members to remain soldiers, and a chain of command to authorize and coordinate the mission. None of these conditions were met. Maine, Tonkin, and Sadler had signed civilian contracts. They carried no weapons. They had no combat mission. They answered to no military authority. The version placing these men in a Christmas battle against Nazis in Queen Maud Land in 1945 also requires ignoring geography. The bases of Operation Tabarin and its successor FIDs were all on the Antarctic Peninsula. Queen Maud Land lay across the Weddell Sea, a body of water approximately 1,000 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, covered with sea ice at that time of year. No FIDS vessel visited that sector during the years of Operation Tabarin or in the immediately following years. The region was under Norwegian claim and completely outside the strategic or scientific area of interest of the British organization. Between September 1939 and May 1945, Antarctica was essentially a continent parallel to the war, present in the strategic calculations of some powers, but absent as an actual theatre of operations. Naval warfare in the South Atlantic began to have Antarctic relevance from the early months of the conflict, although indirectly. The South Atlantic was a critical supply route for Britain from South America and for the transport of raw materials between the Commonwealth dominions and the metropolis. German surface cruisers and later Kriegsmarine submarines operated in these waters from early on. The pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, one of the most modern ships of the Kriegsmarine, had been operating in the South Atlantic since August 1939, even before the formal declaration of war, sinking 9 British merchant ships. its pursuit and the Battle of the River Plate on December 13, 1939, which forced it to seek refuge in Montevideo and led to its scuttling by its own crew on December 17, was the most dramatic naval episode in these waters during the early months of the war. In this context, the islands and bays of the Western Antarctic sector gained specific strategic value. Deception Island, with its perfectly protected inner volcanic bay and coal deposits accumulated over decades of Norwegian and British whaling activity, was the only point in hundreds of kilometers where a ship could find refuge, resupply, and carry out minor repairs. The Admiralty in London was fully aware of this value, so was the Argentine Navy. The first British action in the region, the visit of HMS Queen of Bermuda to Deception Island in March 1941, followed exactly this logic: destroy the coal and pierce the fuel tanks so that no German surface ship could use the port as a support base. The German auxiliary cruisers, the so-called Hilfskreuzer, operated extensively in the South Atlantic and even the Antarctic Ocean during 1940 and 1941. Atlantis, Penguin and Thor conducted raids in these waters, attacking merchant ships and in some cases whaling facilities. Penguin, under the command of Captain zur See Ernst Felix Kruger, captured in January 1941 an entire Norwegian whaling fleet operating in Antarctic waters, the factory ship Ola Vega and 11 whaling ships, in one of the most lucrative naval prize operations for Germany during the war. Penguin was sunk by the British cruiser HMS Cornwall on May 8, 1941. These auxiliary cruisers needed resupply points, and the remote waters of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean were their operational zones. But none visited Queen Maud Land or attempted to establish any facility on the Antarctic continent. Their logistical needs were met through rendezvous at sea with supply ships and occasionally through calls at neutral or friendly ports. German submarines began operating more systematically in the South Atlantic from 1942, when the strengthening of anti-submarine defenses in the North Atlantic forced the Kriegsmarine to seek alternative routes and targets. The waters off the coasts of Brazil, Argentina, and the Cape of Good Hope became patrol areas for long-range submarines, mainly types 9C and 9D. Between 1942 and 1944, these submarines sank dozens of merchant ships in the South Atlantic. Their patrol records, preserved in captured German archives and microfilmed by the Allies, document precisely their routes, positions, encounters, and fuel consumption. None of these records show any deviation toward Antarctic waters. The impact of the war on whaling activity was total and immediate. The German whaling fleet, which had produced nearly 500,000 barrels of oil in the 1938 to 1939 season, carried out no operations in the following years. Factory ships and whalers were converted for military or commercial use, or left inactive. The same occurred with the whaling fleets of other countries. Whaling in Antarctica practically disappeared during the war years, except for some very limited Norwegian operations in the early seasons. Antarctic waters during those years were essentially empty of regular human activity. Scientific activity in Antarctica was also not non-existent during the war, although it was scarce. Operation Tabarin, initiated in 1944, constituted the most organized and continuous human presence on the continent during this period. Its bases on Deception Island, Port Lockroy and Hope Bay carried out meteorological and ionospheric observations of operational value for the war in the Atlantic. Meteorological data from the South Atlantic were relevant for predicting conditions in the North Atlantic, where the Battle of the Atlantic was being fought. The ionospheric observations at Port Lockroy contributed to knowledge of radio propagation conditions in the Southern Hemisphere, information with direct military applications for naval communications. The Operation Tabarin bases operated with minimal resources. Supplies were delivered by annual visits of ships bringing food, fuel, and mail, and returning to the Falklands with rotated personnel. Winters were periods of absolute isolation, with no possibility of medical evacuation or reinforcement in case of emergency. Communications with the outside world depended on the radio equipment operated by each base, subject to the interference imposed by Antarctic ionospheric conditions on shortwave frequencies. The diaries of expedition members describe life at these bases with a mixture of admiration for the landscape and resignation to monotony and cold. In Queen Maud Land, while all this was happening 1,000 kilometers to the west, no human being was present. The territory discovered and photographed by the Schwabenland expedition in January and February 1939 lay in Antarctic silence, with the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains emerging from the ice like dark rock spines against the sky. Winter temperatures at these altitudes dropped to -50 degrees Celsius. Katabatic winds, generated when cold, dense air from the polar plateau descends toward the coast along the continental slope, accelerating to storm speeds, could exceed 150 kilometers per hour in the passes between the mountains. Under these conditions, any human installation would have required continuous logistical support just to survive the winter. Without such effort, any structure built with 1939 resources would have been destroyed by the wind or buried under snow within weeks. The history of what did not happen in Queen Maud Land between 1939 and 1945 also has a verifiable scientific dimension. Antarctic ice acts as an archive of human activity. Materials deposited in the atmosphere by industrial activity, nuclear explosions, or large-scale combustion are trapped in the annual snow layers that accumulate over the plateau and compact into ice over time. Ice cores extracted from this platform allow the reconstruction of the atmospheric composition at any point in the past with the precision of individual years. If between 1939 and 1945 there had been industrial activity in Queen Maud Land, as the secret base theory requires, construction, machinery, power generation, heating, it would have left chemically detectable traces in the ice cores later collected by scientific expeditions. Those traces do not exist. The most concrete demonstration of the absence of any German installation in the region is provided by the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition of 1949 to 1952. This expedition spent 2 full winters at the Maudheim base on the western coast of Queen Maud Land and carried out extensive inland trips using tracked vehicles. They covered considerable areas of the coastal ice platform and the foothills of the interior mountain range. They found no traces of previous human presence. The Swedish, Norwegian, and British scientists who wrote the expedition reports, published in a series of scientific volumes by Oslo University Press, mention no findings of structures, equipment, or materials that could indicate prior human activity. If there had been a German base in this region, even a small one, it would have left evidence that any competent scientific expedition would have detected. Imagine building a base in the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains during the austral summer of 1939, not with the resources of a well-equipped modern expedition, but with the specific resources that the Schwabenland carried on board. The first problem was the distance. The edge of the coastal ice shelf, the most accessible point from the sea, was about 200 kilometers from the front of the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains. This distance could not be covered in a straight line. The terrain between the coast and the mountains was a gradual slope of continental ice with a seemingly smooth surface that concealed a network of crevasses. Glacier crevasses are fractures in the ice caused by mechanical stresses generated by the movement of the ice sheet over the underlying bedrock. They can range from a few centimeters to several meters wide, tens of meters deep, and may be covered by snow bridges that can support a person's weight until they fail. Crossing this type of terrain required specific field glaciology techniques, rope teams, probing with poles, pre-scouted routes. The crew of the Schwabenland, made up mostly of sailors and aviation technicians without training in glacier travel, had no such preparation. Roald Amundsen, the best polar explorer of his generation, with equipment perfectly suited to Antarctic terrain, advanced about 24 kilometers per day on his best days during the 1910 to 1912 South Pole expedition, counting on supply depots previously placed along the route. Without these depots, progress would have been slower, as each load would have to be carried in full from the starting point. For men without sledging experience, moving through crevassed terrain would have been substantially slower. At a moderate pace and without incidents, the 200-kilometer journey to the mountains would have taken at least 10 days one way and another 10 days for the return. That consumes 20 of the expedition's total 26 operational days, leaving less than a week to build anything in the mountains, assuming all available men devoted themselves exclusively to that task from day one. But there is a prior factor that makes this calculation even more restrictive: mapping. Before the first reconnaissance flight on January 20th, 1939, no one knew the Mühlig-Hoffmann range existed. The expedition was, by definition, a journey of discovery. The pilots were mapping as they flew. Without an interior map, it is impossible to plan a supply route to a specific point because that specific point had not yet been identified. The decision on where to build a base first requires knowing what is at that location, which could only be determined after aircraft had flown over and photographed the territory. Construction planning would have had to wait until mapping was sufficiently advanced, further reducing the available time. The Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition of 1949 to 1952 offers the best available point of comparison. It reached the coast of Queen Maud Land with tracked vehicles specifically designed to operate on snow and ice, the so-called weasels, light vehicles with wide rubber tracks that distributed their weight over a larger area, reducing ground pressure and allowing operation over fragile or crevassed ice. With these vehicles, the expedition took 18 days to build the first hut of their Maudheim base. Not a full operational base, a hut, a habitable space where men could survive the winter. The Schwabenland carried no tracked vehicles. It carried no sled dogs. Amundsen, who did have them, took 14 days to build his Framheim base in January 1911. The only documented sleds aboard the Schwabenland were small emergency sleds carried on each aircraft fuselage, designed for use if a plane had to make an emergency landing and the crew needed to move away from the wreck. The argument that the seaplanes Boreas and Passat could have served as transports to the interior, carrying people and materials to the mountains, faces equally insurmountable technical obstacles. The Dornier Wal were seaplanes. Their landing gear was the metal fuselage hull, designed to float and glide on water. They had no wheels or skis to land on solid surfaces. They could land on relatively calm water and take off from it. Landing on the interior ice with its uneven surface, hidden crevasses and variable altitude would have irreparably damaged the hull and likely destroyed the aircraft. The expedition's flight logs, published by Richer in 1942 and later analyzed in detail by the cartographer Brunk, confirm that neither plane landed on any solid surface during the entire campaign. All flights over the interior were photographic reconnaissance without ground contact. There is a precedent occasionally cited to suggest that a Dornier Wal could have landed on ice. During the 1925 Arctic expedition, in which Amundsen and Lincoln Ellsworth attempted to reach the North Pole in two Dornier Wal seaplanes, one plane had to make an emergency landing on a floe when the pilots found that the open water where they had alighted was closing. But this landing was a desperate emergency on relatively flat pack ice in the Arctic Ocean, not a planned operation on the Antarctic continental ice with its irregular topography and crevasses. Amundsen described this incident as one of the most terrifying moments of his life as an explorer. The geothermal argument deserves specific analysis because it was the seed from which the most elaborate version of the secret base legend grew. Ernst Hermann, the geographer of the Schwabenland expedition, published a popular science book in 1942, Deutsche Forscher im Südpolarmeer, in which he speculated on the origin of the Schirmacher Oasis lakes. His hypothesis was that these lakes, which did not freeze in winter despite low outside temperatures, must be heated by underground volcanic activity. To support this idea, Hermann drew a crustal weakness line through the central Atlantic, past the volcanoes of Jan Mayen, the Azores, Ascension, Tristan da Cunha, and Bouvetoya, and hypothetically extended it southward across Queen Maud Land to connect with the active Erebus volcano on the other side of the continent. Hermann was partly correct. The central Atlantic volcanoes are indeed aligned along a fracture in the oceanic crust, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which marks the boundary between the American and African plates, and hosts abundant volcanic and hydrothermal activity. But that ridge does not reach Queen Maud Land. It ends in a T-junction with other ridge systems around 54 degrees south near Bouvetoya. Further south, there is no continuation of the volcanic system. The distance from the southern end of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge to the coast of Queen Maud Land is over 1,200 kilometers of ocean with no documented volcanic or hydrothermal activity. The Schirmacher Oasis lakes are not geothermally heated. Later studies showed they form from summer melting of surface snow and retain liquid water due to the topographic protection of the surrounding rock walls, which reduce wind speed and allow the water surface to reach positive temperatures during the summer months. Geological research in Queen Maud Land from the time of the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition to the present has found no evidence of active geothermal or volcanic activity in the region. The geological synthesis work by R.J. Tingey, published in 1991 in the collective volume The Geology of Antarctica, Oxford University Press, is explicit. No volcanic or geothermal activity has been reported in Queen Maud Land. The active volcanoes of Antarctica, Erebus in the Ross Sea and Deception Island on the Antarctic Peninsula, are thousands of kilometers away. The idea of geothermally heated caves under the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains has no basis in the continent's geology. Antarctic subglacial lakes, which do exist and are actively studied, operate in a completely different way than the legend suggests. The most famous of these, Lake Vostok, 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, lies beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice on the polar plateau. It remains liquid due to the combination of the pressure from the overlying ice, which lowers the water's freezing point, and geothermal heat rising from the Earth's interior through the bedrock. There is no airspace above these lakes. They are completely filled with water, with ice above and rock below. They are not habitable caves. They are depressions in rock beneath kilometers of ice. No one could live there even if they could reach it. The evidence collected by over 1,000 scientists who have visited Queen Maud Land since the Norwegian, British, Swedish expedition is the most compelling refutation of the existence of any secret installation in this region. That expedition covered vast areas of the interior with tracked vehicles. Expeditions of the International Geophysical Year 1957 to 1958, with Belgian and Norwegian stations in the region, conducted systematic reconnaissance flights. Since then, air traffic over the area has been continuous, and the territory has been mapped with meter-resolution Landsat imagery. In the interior of Antarctica, snow accumulation is minimal in mountainous areas because the wind prevents snow from settling on exposed surfaces. Any installation built there would not have been buried and hidden by snow. It would have remained visible, deteriorating under the effects of wind, cold, and ultraviolet radiation until one of the dozens of expeditions visiting the area would have found it. None have found it, because it never existed.